Today's topic is what is culture? In today's class, we're going to learn what culture is, 10 different characteristics of culture, how culture works, and the relationship between culture and individuals. So what is culture? Culture is a characteristic that we believe still to be unique to humans. Now, first of all, I want to clarify something. Sometimes when we use the word culture, we talk about people as not having it, right? Somebody who we believe is not educated or is not a refined person, an elegant person. We say things like, that is not a person of culture. However, that is not absolutely the way in which anthropologists use the word culture. For us, culture does not refer to a social class, a pattern of consumption, buying certain fancy things, or a particular aesthetic, a particular kind of look or elegance. That is not what we mean by culture at all. Culture, however, is difficult to define. The first definition by an anthropologist was in 1871. British anthropologist Edward B. Tyler said that culture is that complex whole which includes knowledge, belief, art, law, morals, custom, and any other capabilities and habits acquired by man as a member of society. Now, this definition was important because it recognized that it's complex, that it includes a lot of things, right? So there's a list of things that it includes, and that we acquire it because we're in a society. It's a group thing. It is not an individual thing. However, that definition is well over 100 years old, and so we don't really use that one anymore. A better definition talks not just about what culture is, but what culture does. And so I like this definition. Culture is a system of beliefs, behavior, and artifacts and customs that are shared by members of a society and that they use to deal with the world and with themselves, and which is transmitted through learning. So this is a big definition, but it includes a lot of important characteristics. First of all, culture includes what we believe, how we behave. It includes artifacts or things, all the material things that we use in our daily lives, right? And our habits. It also says that culture is shared by people who are part of a society. And more importantly, it says, why do we have culture? We have culture because we use it to deal with our world. Culture helps us navigate the complex natural and social world. Now, you might be asking yourselves whether other primates also have culture or other animals in general have culture. We say that other primates, excuse me, exhibit social behavior but not culture. Why not? We know that they have different habits of hygiene and care. They pick insects off of their fur, they groom each other, they use some simple tools like digging sticks, and they participate in social activities like war. However, we say that they don't have culture because, as far as we know, they don't apply symbolic meaning to their behavior. Okay? They do these things, but they don't reflect about these things. They don't think about these things. They don't mean anything to them. And we're going to learn a little bit later what exactly we mean by that. Also, we first observed culture approximately 250,000 years ago with the evidence again of symbolic behavior, right? We have found art like cave paintings and burials as old as 250,000 years. And we know that these things are associated with symbolic behavior, right? There's no reason to create art except that it gives us meaning. There's no reason why hundreds of thousands of years ago humans buried their dead in a specific way or with amulets or with different things, right? This is all symbolic behavior that's clearly cultural behavior. Okay, so more than finding one specific definition, it's important to understand all these different characteristics of culture. They're all very important. The first one is that culture is the main adaptive tool for humans. Okay? Adaptation in biology refers to a process whereby organisms adjust to their environments to survive and reproduce. Humans have to survive in a specific environment long enough at least to reproduce, to have babies and keep the species going, right? Now, all living things have different mechanisms for adaptation. The first one being genetic. Genetic adaptation is very useful, but it takes a very long time. You need multiple generations for genetic adaptation to happen to a specific environment. We also have physiological adaptation, and humans have a few, not very many, but we do have some physiological systems of adaptation. For example, if any of us move from Puerto Rico to the Andes Mountains, of course, which is a much higher altitude, at first we're going to have trouble breathing because we know that at higher altitudes, air doesn't have as much oxygen. So the amount of air that each of us usually breathes in Puerto Rico, at higher altitudes, it won't have enough oxygen for us to be healthy. Now, if we wait approximately 3 months, all of us are going to have a physiological change happen to our bodies. Our um, capacity to inhale air is going to increase. So we're actually going to breathe a higher quantity of air to acquire the same amount of oxygen. This is physiological adaptation. It's useful, but it's limited, and it also takes some time. Humans, however, have cultural adaptation, and cultural adaptation has become increasingly the main way by which we adapt and survive to different environments. I'm going to give you an example. If we take a polar bear from the Arctic regions and bring him down to the Caribbean, that polar bear without human intervention is going to die, right? It's going to be too hot for that animal. They're not going to be in a familiar environment. They're not going to know um, how to fish, like where to find food, right? However, if we magically brought some Inuit people from the same polar environment into the Caribbean, they're going to probably survive. They're going to figure out that, first of all, they need to take off all these coats. They're going to learn Spanish. They're going to observe. They're going to ask for help, right? They're going to be okay. That's culture. And culture is very useful because culture can be instantaneous. A cultural change can happen from 1 minute to the other. When you put on a jacket or take off a jacket to survive the current weather, that's culture. Now, some aspects of culture are not adaptive. They're either neutral or they're even maladaptive. I'll give you an example. If we drive a car, we might have a personal preference for the color of this car, but it doesn't really matter. It doesn't matter for our survival if this car is blue or black or purple or pink, right? In general. That's a neutral aspect. Now, some parts of culture are maladaptive. For example, the ancient Maya started facing um, droughts in their environment, and they explained these droughts in terms of for religious reasons, right? So they thought that the way to stop these droughts and their crops from dying was to build a lot of temples to satisfy their gods. Well, that particular belief was maladaptive because that wasn't helping their crops, right? They didn't figure out the farming techniques, right? They didn't focus on how they can change farming techniques to adapt to drier weather. Okay, that's an example of a maladaptive cultural belief. Now, speaking of the car, it doesn't really matter what color car we drive. But the fact that we live in societies that depend on fossil fuels to power our technology, that's clearly maladaptive, right? We're facing the consequences of climate change. July was the hottest month ever recorded on the planet. We are being very maladaptive in terms of our use of energy in general. Characteristic is that culture is integrated into a system. A system refers to a group of elements that are connected in a way that if you change one, it alters the others, right? All parts of society and culture are connected to each other. You can't change one thing in a society and not impact other aspects of its culture, okay? So religion and technology are related. The economy, gender, and politics, that's related. The family and art, these are different parts of culture that we don't necessarily think go together, but they do. They can, we can always figure out how they're related in some way, connected in some way. I'm going to give you an example. How participating in a war changed gender roles, and I'm focusing on the United States, but really you can argue this for most of the countries that participated in a war. So in 1939, right, the United States enters the Second World War. And when you have a lot of men, most of the men participating in warfare in a society, all these jobs that men used to fulfill are empty, right? And so women started doing men's jobs in the United States. They started working in factories, they started filling office jobs, everything that men used to do that could not do now because they were fighting a war, right? Over time, that meant that there was an increase in women's purchasing power. Before this, women in general, on average, did not know what it was like to have your own money, right? Their role in society was to be a housewife. If they needed money to shop, right, to buy something for the house, they had to ask their husbands. So suddenly they're working, they're making their own money, and they are figuring out this is great. It feels great to have money to buy things without having to ask permission. It gives you independence. It makes you feel good about yourself, right? Now, once the war ended, all these policies after the war sought to replace women with men again, right? The idea was, okay, the war is over, women go back inside the house, men go back out there in the workplace. But the problem is that this seed of economic independence was already planted. Women liked having jobs, they liked what it did to other aspects of their life, right, to be able to make their own money, and they weren't going back. And as women increased their participation in productive aspects of society, right? As women began to have more and more jobs outside of the home, society's ideas about women began to change, right? Women were no longer defined only as people who should aspire to have husbands and cook and clean all day, right? So some historical event over time led to an entirely different way of perceiving women in society. That's culture being integrated. A third characteristic is that culture is all-encompassing. This means that there's no aspect of humans that is not mediated by culture. If we think about something like eating, right? Eating, you can argue, is a biological behavior of humans, right? In fact, all living things have to eat. However, humans don't just eat. Our eating, right, passes through a cultural lens. So what foods are considered appropriate to eat, how you cook them, who cooks them, who is it okay to eat with? Do you sit on the floor? Do you sit on a chair, right? What is considered the appropriate way of behaving when you're eating? What do you do before you eat, while you eat, when you're finished eating? All these things vary by culture, right? Even our most, and animalistic biological behaviors still have to go through culture. A fourth characteristic is that culture is symbolic. A symbol is something that represents something else with which it has no intrinsic connection. And all of culture is symbolic. I'm going to give you some examples here. If we think of a traffic light, we all know that when the light is green, we go. When the light is red, we stop. There is nothing intrinsically related between green and going and red and stopping, right? It could be any other color. However, as a society, we agreed that when we see green, we go. When we see red, we stop. This is a symbol. The traffic light, the colors in a traffic light are symbols, and everything about culture is symbolic. If we think about flags, for example, right? This is the flag of Puerto Rico. This is not literally, the archipelago of Puerto Rico. It is not literally the humans who live here in Puerto Rico. It's just a piece of fabric with some color and some lines in it, right? But of course, to people, our flags are not just a piece of fabric with color and pictures in it, right? They're symbolic. They represent all of our land, all of our people. Flags, like everything else cultural, are symbols. And symbols can get very disputed, right? Nobody really cares. Nobody's really fighting the fact that green means go and red means stop, for example. But when we look at some of the bigger debates in society today, for example, abortion rights, that debate itself is symbolic, right? The act, the biological, no, the medical or surgical act of removing a fetus from a woman's uterus, that in itself is not symbolic, right? This is just a clinical act. You remove a fetus from a womb. But what does that represent, right? What does that abortion represent? Does it represent the killing of babies, or does it represent a woman's right over her own body? That's symbolic, right? And again, everything in culture is symbolic. Fifth characteristic, culture is learned through enculturation, okay? Humans have three different ways by which we learn our culture. One, and probably the most used form of learning, is observation. Babies are observing the adults around them all the time, right? We know a lot about our culture just because we see it and we learn it that way. And we don't even notice that we're learning, but we're learning, right? We observe and we take cues from everybody and we learn in our specific culture what's okay and what's not okay. How are you supposed to do things? What are you not supposed to do? We also learn through experience, right? If a little child touches a hot stove, right? Maybe they never observed this, but they touch a hot stove and their hand gets burned, they're not going to do it again, right? And so a lot of times we just learn through experience. Sometimes when we travel to a different country as adults, we also learn from experience, right? We do things that other people look at us strange, like, why are they behaving this way? And this is how we know not to do it, right? We also learn culture through direct learning. Sometimes we're told by our parents, our families, our church, our school, right? Our government, the television, they're constantly telling us what's considered appropriate and not appropriate in our specific culture. A sixth characteristic is that culture gives meaning to reality. Okay? And this is very important. Humans don't just go through life doing things. We give meaning to everything, right? The way that we dress always means something, right? Clothes, technically, the only thing that they have to do is protect our bodies from the environment, from the heat, from the cold, from the rain, from the dust, right? But humans, we don't just wear clothes, right? We give meaning to them. The colors that we use sometimes represent our tribe in different cultures, or certain patterns like flowers we consider feminine, but certain colors we consider them masculine, right? If we think about our computers, right? We just need the laptop to do its job. But we don't just have a laptop. We choose specific colors that we think represent our personalities. We put stickers on them to personalize them, right? We're constantly giving meaning to reality. 7, culture is differentially shared. Okay? Even though we tend to share culture in general with the rest of our society, we don't all have exactly the same beliefs and behaviors. Age is one reason why. Younger people tend to have slightly different culture than older people. Gender is another one. Your social class. Working class people don't share the exact same culture as upper class people. Your ethnicity, right? You might have different habits if you consider yourself uh, Afro versus Latino versus Asian. Religion is another source of difference. Educational level, tribe in some societies that recognize tribes, caste in societies that recognize caste, right? The point is that we all have different identities, and even if we generally share the bigger culture, we still have some differences based on these particular characteristics. And this is why we're also able to have subcultures, right? Subcultures are smaller groups that share aspects of the general culture, and they have their own characteristics as well. Okay, so the larger the society, the more complex it is, the more people it has, the more subcultures are going to pop up. Here are some uh, examples of subcultures, right? We know in Western societies in the 1960s and 70s, we had the hippies. Today we have hipsters, right? We all know what hipsters are. The roller derby girls is another subculture in the United States, for example. And here, in all these subcultures, they're associated, or they were associated primarily with white Americans, right? With people in their 20s and 30s, perhaps, right? Um, Middle class people. So there's not a lot of difference in here, except this is a difference in this case of um, both consumption patterns and entertainment and beliefs, right? There's other things that are creating these subcultures. An eighth characteristic is that culture exists at different levels: the universal, the general, and the individual. The universal level of culture are all the things that we find in every human society. For example, marriage. Every single society in the world has some form of marriage as an institution. Now, the interesting thing to me about culture is that universal aspect, and I'll tell you why in a minute. A general aspect of culture is something that is found in many societies, but not universally across all societies. For example, the number of people that you can marry. Societies where you can only marry one person are very common. Societies where you can marry multiple people are also very common. And then there is the individual level of culture, right? These are all the details that vary by society. Who you can marry, at what age you can start getting married, what does the ceremony look like, right? All these different details about weddings and marriage and rules around marriage, right, are the individual level of culture. Now, as humans, it's very easy to observe these individual differences and to focus on that, right? We can look at other societies and say, oh, why do they dress so differently than we do when they get married? Oh, that's weird that they can marry more than one person, right? We can focus on the differences because they're very evident. But as an anthropologist, the interesting stuff is here. Yeah, this is fun to look at, but more importantly, why does marriage exist universally as a human institution? That's the interesting question. Now, when we get to the module where we discuss marriage, you're going to have all the answers. I'm not going to give them to you right now. A ninth characteristic of culture is that it is constantly changing. Okay? Culture changes all the time, and that's a good thing, right? Sometimes these changes are controversial. Big cultural changes are not easy. It causes a lot of friction in society, but they're important, right? Because it has to change so that it allows us to adapt. Okay? Culture can change through innovation, which are internal changes. A lot of technological innovations are internal, right? Like the invention of the wheel, the creation of computers. Society sometimes change things on their own. Culture also changes through diffusion. Diffusion is the transmission of a cultural element from one group to the other. For example, all across North America, Latin America, right? Parts of Africa, many parts in the world, we see government buildings that kind of look like this, right? Well, we know, right, that this form of architecture did not originate independently in all these parts of the world, right? Because of historical events of conquest and colonization, we have a lot of influence from ancient Roman and Greek culture, including its architecture. Also changes through acculturation. Acculturation refers to the adoption of cultural traits from other groups. Okay, now students sometimes get these two mixed up. Diffusion, think about it as one society being the center, and aspects of that society, of the culture of that society, go to other societies around the world. Acculturation is more from the perspective of individuals. Okay? With acculturation, what happens is that an individual absorbs those elements of another culture. And the picture that I had there was Americans celebrating Cinco de Mayo, right? They absorb this event, right? This celebration that happens only in one part of Mexico, in Puebla, Mexico, and they change the meaning, right? They absorb this Cinco de Mayo day, but they don't have a very boring celebration of a historical battle like they do in Mexico. They have a big party where they get drunk. Okay, the final characteristic of culture is that it includes both beliefs and behaviors. Okay, this is important to me because some anthropologists believe that culture only includes the beliefs, but beliefs and behaviors are related. Okay, if you see a behavior being accepted in a society, it's because there's a belief behind that that says that this behavior is acceptable. I have this picture here of some older Russian men kissing on the mouth, the side of the mouth, hello. Because in Russian society, even today, for example, the topic of homosexuality is very controversial. The law does not accept homosexuality in Russia. Homosexuals are persecuted, but historically, it has always been culturally acceptable for men to kiss each other quickly on the mouth as a greeting in Russian culture. Okay. So now you know a lot about these different characteristics of culture. We're going to focus then on how does culture work? Okay, these are the characteristics, but how do we use culture in everyday life? We do this through cultural codes and cultural norms. Cultural codes are the ideas that people have about their world and how they categorize it. And this is really important. I want you to think of your brains as a computer, right? All of us have computers, or we use computers, and we know that in the computer we have different folders and we call them different things, right? We might have a folder that says schoolwork, another one that says, pictures, another one that says finances, and we have information there about our finances, right? However you organize the different folders in your computer. And then inside those folders, we add other folders, right? We're organizing all the information in our computer. So if you have a folder called classes, then maybe each of the classes that you have taken has a folder. Or maybe you have a folder with each semester, and inside that folder, you have each individual class. And inside that class, you might have a readings folder, you might have a homework folder, right? So the same way that we organize all the information in the computer into folders, right? Otherwise, we know it gets very messy. Humans have to organize all the information that we're exposed to every day in our brains, right? We all do that. Where culture comes in and where it gets challenging is that according to our culture, the folders that we have in our brain to categorize the world are different. So you and I can be looking at exactly the same moment, right? We might be at the park and we're looking at the same thing happening, but because the folders in my brain, the cultural codes, have different categories than yours, we're interpreting that information, that reality, in a very different way. Okay? I have an example here of this woman selling fabric in Haiti as an example that I had a student many years ago when I used to work in Ohio who received some funding to do a research project in Haiti. And she was African American. And she said, I'm not going to have any problems because I'm Black and they're Black. And I thought, well, you are going to have some problems because you're not Haitian and they can tell, right? Well, it turns out that she had a huge problem because she was getting harassed by men a lot. Why? Because the objective reality is you have a 20, I think she was 20-year-old young woman at that time traveling by herself to Haiti to collect data for a project, right? This is objectively what was happening. In the folders in her brain, in her cultural codes, she codified her behavior as independent student who is excelling at college, right? But the Haitian men, right, saw her behavior and categorized it according to their cultural codes, which is woman who does not respect herself because she's traveling by herself in a foreign country, and therefore it's okay for us to harass her. Cultural codes are very important. Cultural norms, on the other hand, are the accepted patterns of behavior. Okay? Cultural norms are not laws. Okay? This is not in the Constitution. You're not going to go to jail if you violate a cultural norm. Nobody probably taught you cultural norms. You observe them from a young age. Here's a classic example. We know that when we get in an elevator, if there's only one person or two people in that elevator, we're supposed to stand as far away from them as we can, right? And even before COVID, this is not about germs and viruses, right? It's just weird. It's considered weird if you go and you stand right next to somebody that you don't know in an elevator. That's a cultural norm. That's how we're supposed to act. We just know. We just know because we live in a society, okay, where this is the norm. Now, I have a bit of a fun assignment for all of you. By next week, I want you to identify a cultural norm and violate it, okay? And that instruction is in the other video, so hopefully you saw it. Okay, the last thing I wanted to talk about was the relationship between culture and individuals, which is to say, this constant tension between what we call structure and agency. Individuals, culture influences, but it does not determine our behavior. And this is very important. Yes, we're born into a specific culture and we learn that culture from the time that we're born and we learn it the rest of our lives. So of course, our culture has a lot of weight into our beliefs and the way that we behave in this world. But it does not have to determine our behavior. culture can change, and as humans, we have the power to change the parts of our culture that are not working for us, that are not adaptive, okay? When we talk about structure in anthropology and the social sciences in general, we're talking about the ordering of social relationships. These things that just don't change easily in a society. It can change, but it takes a long time because it's such a repeated behavior in a society, right? If you think about a building made out of cement, for example, that's the structural stuff in a society, right? You can tear down a cement building, but it's not easy. It's strong. It's been there for a long time, right? Well, humans, we have something called agency, and this is our ability to change our structural conditions. It's not easy, but we can do it, right? For example, if we're born in poverty, right? We're born in a community, in a family that does not have a lot of economic resources. Well, poverty in general in a society, that's structure. You can't just snap your fingers and you're not poor anymore, right? There's a lot of things when you're born without a lot of economic wealth that are constantly pushing down on you, right? You just don't have the money for certain things. You don't have access to certain opportunities that can make your life better, and other people do, right? But still, even within the weight of those difficult conditions, we know that there are little things that we can do to slowly improve our conditions, right? We can try to save a little bit of money if we have it. We can protest the government for our rights to change laws that are not beneficial to us. Or we can come together with our community of neighbors and figure out ways that we can collectively improve our situation, even if individually we don't have the resources for it, right? That's agency. And I want you to take away from this presentation, right, that we have both the ability and maybe even the responsibility, right, to fight those parts of our culture that might be structural. They might look like we can't change them, right? But if we know they're not good for us as a society, we can definitely little by little use our agency to change them.